The dust tasted of endings. It coated Cassian's tongue, a grit of salt and sun-bleached bone that the wind carried down from the high mesas. He knelt, the leather of his trousers cracking in protest, and touched the track in the dirt. Small. A child's boot, the heel worn down on one side. She was close. The man who'd paid him, a man with a soft face and hard eyes named Silas, had called her a stray. A loose thread in a tapestry of land grants and bloodlines Cassian didn't care about. The gold was good. That was all that mattered. He was a man of simple transactions, a life for a wage. He'd been called worse things than a mercenary. He'd been called a brother, a son, a friend, and those were the names that had cost him everything. Mercenary was clean. It had no memory. He rose, his gaze sweeping the labyrinth of red rock and skeletal juniper. The sun was a hammer, beating the color from the sky, leaving a pale, washed-out blue that offered no comfort. He moved with a predator's economy, his footsteps silent on the baked earth. He'd been tracking her for 3 days, from the scorched ruins of a homestead to this final, desolate place. A place of execution. The coordinates were precise, a spire of rock that looked like a broken tooth against the horizon. Silas's other man would be there, a man named Fletcher, whose only job was to witness the act and ensure the gold was earned. Cassian didn't need a witness. His reputation was its own ledger, written in blood and closed contracts. He saw her then. A small shape huddled in the sliver of shade at the base of the rock spire. She wasn't hiding. She was waiting. Her dress was the color of the dirt, a faded calico that had seen too much sun. Her hair was a dark, tangled mess. He stopped, the heat shimmering around him, and for a moment, the world went quiet. The wind died. The buzz of insects ceased. There was only the sight of her, small and still. He expected tears. He expected a plea. Children cried. They begged. It was the nature of the thing. She didn't cry. She turned her head and her eyes found his. They were dark, ancient things, too old for a face so small. They held no fear, only a deep, unnerving calm, a stillness that mirrored the dead heart of the canyon. He felt a tremor in his gut, a cold thing that had nothing to do with the heat. He'd seen that look before, in a mirror, in the eyes of men he was about to kill, but never in a child. He started walking again, his boots crunching on the gravel, the sound unnaturally loud. Each step felt heavy, as if he were wading through water. Fletcher stepped out from behind the rock, his face slick with sweat and impatience. He held a Colt, its barrel glinting in the sun. "Took you long enough, Bray," he grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the hot stone. "Let's get this done. The boss is waiting." Cassian's eyes never left the girl. She looked familiar. Not her face, but the shape of her. The thin shoulders. The way her hands were clasped in her lap as if holding something precious that no one else could see. A ghost flickered at the edge of his vision. Another girl, another time, a firelit street, and a name he'd tried to drink into oblivion. Ilara. He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. The name was a shard of glass in his memory. "What are you waiting for?" Fletcher's voice was sharp. "The deal was you handle it, I just watch." The girl, Una, Silas had given him the name, spat it out like a curse, pushed herself to her feet. She stood no taller than his waist. She looked from Fletcher's gun to Cassian's face. There was no accusation in her gaze. Only a question, a silent, profound question that he had no answer for. He was Cassian Bray. He finished his contracts. It was the only code he had left. He'd dismantled his own life, piece by piece, until only this brutal simplicity remained. A man pays. A man dies. Gender and age were just details on a bill of sale. He took another step. He could feel the weight of the knife at his belt, the cold promise of the pistol holstered on his hip. He could do it. A single clean motion. He'd done it 100 times. It was just a stray, a loose thread. But the thread was attached to something inside him, a knot of scar tissue he thought had long gone numb. She looked like someone he'd never saved. She looked like the ghost he carried. Fletcher grew agitated. The sun was relentless. "Damn it, Bray, do it or I will. The boss pays for a result, not a goddamn prayer meeting." The Colt leveled, its black eyes swinging past Cassian, settling on the small, still form of the child. She didn't flinch, not once, even as the gun leveled, even as Fletcher's finger tightened on the trigger. The world didn't slow down. There was no cinematic grace. There was only a choice, made in the blood and the muscle, faster than thought. He stepped between her and the bullet. He didn't do it because he was good. He wasn't. He was a hollowed-out thing, a vessel for violence. He did it because he couldn't bear to see that ghost again. He did it because for one searing, impossible moment, her eyes were Alara's eyes, and this time, he wouldn't run. The gunshot was a physical blow, a white-hot fist that punched through his side, stealing his breath and setting his nerves on fire. The impact threw him back, a stumbling, graceless motion. He saw Fletcher's look of stunned disbelief, the tobacco juice dribbling from his slack jaw. The second shot was coming. Cassian's hand was already moving, his own pistol clearing the holster in a blur of worn leather. The world narrowed to a tunnel. Him and Fletcher. The girl was a peripheral shape, a reason, not a target. His shot was first. It took Fletcher in the throat, a wet, explosive sound that was swallowed by the vast silence of the canyon. The man dropped his Colt, his hands clawing at the red ruin of his neck, and collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. He was dead before he hit the ground. Silence returned, heavier this time, thick with the smell of gunpowder and fresh blood. Cassian stood swaying, his left hand clamped over the hole in his side. Blood, hot and slick, pulsed between his fingers. The pain was a living thing, a serpent coiling in his gut, its fangs dripping fire. He gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw standing out like cords of rope. He looked at the girl. Una hadn't moved. She was staring at Fletcher's body, then at the dark stains spreading across Cassian's shirt. Her expression was unreadable. Not fear, not relief. Just watching, as if he were a strange and violent weather pattern she was trying to understand. He staggered to the rock spire and slid down its rough surface, leaving a smear of blood. His vision was starting to swim, the edges darkening. The hammer of the sun was now inside his head. He had to move. Silas would know something was wrong when Fletcher didn't return. He would send more men, better men, men who wouldn't hesitate. "We have to go," he rasped, the words tearing at his dry throat. She said nothing. She walked over to him, her small boots making no sound. She knelt in the dust in front of him, her dark eyes fixed on the wound. His hand was slick with blood, the flow thick and steady. He was dying. He knew the signs. The cold sweat on his brow, the metallic taste in his mouth, the way the light was starting to fray at the seams. He fumbled with his belt, trying to get to the small pouch of medical supplies. His fingers were clumsy, numb. The world tilted, a sickening lurch. He was going to pass out. He was going to die here, in this god-forsaken kiln, and Silas's men would find her standing over his body. Then he felt a touch. Her hand, small and cool, rested on his. She gently pushed his fumbling fingers aside. From a tiny hidden pocket in her worn dress, she pulled out a coin. It was old, Spanish silver, worn smooth by countless hands. It wasn't payment. It wasn't a trinket. She looked at him, her gaze intense, and then she carefully, deliberately, placed the cool, flat disk of silver directly over the bleeding hole in his side. He gasped, a sharp intake of breath as the cold metal met the hot, torn flesh. It was a child's gesture, a piece of magical thinking in a world that had beaten all the magic out of him. It should have been meaningless. But it wasn't. The focused pressure, the shock of the cold. It was an anchor, A single point of sensation in a swirling sea of pain. It cleared his head for a fraction of a second. Enough. He looked at her, at this silent, strange child who was supposed to be his victim. She had marked him. Not with a bullet, but with this small, absurd act of grace. The coin wouldn't stop the bleeding. It wouldn't mend the torn muscle or the shattered rib. But it was a claim. A debt. He had taken the bullet meant for her. Now, it seemed, she was taking the wound as hers to tend. With a surge of will that came from a place deeper than muscle, he pushed himself away from the rock. The pain screamed, a chorus of jagged voices in his head. He had to get them out of the open. He saw a narrow fissure in the canyon wall, a dark slash of shadow that promised shelter. He lurched towards it, one hand clutching the coin to his side, the other grabbing his pistol from the ground. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He knew she was. He could feel her presence at his back, a silent, steady weight. He was no longer Cassian Bray, mercenary. He was a wounded animal, and this small, silent child was his only reason to keep moving. The desert didn't care about redemption. It only cared about survival. And survival had just become a shared burden. The fissure was deeper than it looked, a cool, dark throat that swallowed them whole, hiding them from the unforgiving eye of the sun. Cassian collapsed against the stone wall, his legs giving out. The darkness was a relief, but the pain was getting worse, a rhythmic, tearing pulse that matched the frantic beat of his heart. He slid to the floor of the narrow passage, the coin slipping from his grasp as his hand fell away, limp. The world was a red and black swirl. He was drowning in it. He felt her presence beside him, a rustle of cloth. He forced his eyes open. She was holding the coin again. She wiped the blood from it with the hem of her dress, her movements precise and unhurried. Then, she tucked it back into her hidden pocket. Her gaze fell on his shirt, soaked through with a terrifying amount of blood. He was bleeding out, and they both knew it. He thought of Silas. Soft hands, clean suit. He thought of Fletcher, the expensive fabric of his shirt now stained with his own lifeblood. A flicker of something cold and hard moved through Cassian's haze of pain. A defiance. He wasn't going to die wrapped in his own filthy rags. He tried to speak, but only a groan escaped. He pointed, a weak, trembling gesture, back towards the mouth of the fissure, towards the dead man lying in the sun. His shirt, he managed to choke out. Una looked at him, her head tilted. She seemed to understand. She gave a single, small nod. She turned and slipped back out into the blinding light, a small, fearless shadow. Cassian's head fell back against the rock. It was a foolish, prideful gesture, a dying man's vanity. But it was more than that. It was a refusal to be erased by the men who had tried to use him as a weapon. He would wear their colors as his bandage. He would wrap his wound in their failure. He must have passed out, because the next thing he knew, she was back. The light from the entrance to the fissure was softer, the sun beginning its slow descent. She was holding a strip of fine white linen, torn from Fletcher's shirt. It was stained in places with the dead man's blood, but it was strong and clean. She knelt beside him again. There was no hesitation in her hands. She worked with a focus that was both terrifying and comforting. She pulled open his shirt, exposing the ragged, ugly wound. The bullet had gone clean through, a blessing he didn't deserve, but the bleeding hadn't stopped. He watched, detached, as if it were happening to another man, as she folded the strip of linen into a thick pad and pressed it firmly against the entry wound. He hissed in pain, his body arching, but she didn't relent. She held the pressure, her small face a mask of concentration. Then, she began to wrap another strip, long and wide, around his torso, binding the makeshift dressing in place. Her hands were deft, her knots sure. She was binding him to life with a piece of the man he'd just killed, with a piece of the world that wanted her dead. The symbolism was so thick and brutal it was almost funny. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels. Her hands were smeared with his blood. She looked at them, then at him. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, but the bleeding seemed to have slowed. The pressure was immense, a fire-laced corset, but it was holding him together. He drifted. In the fever swamp of his mind, faces swam up from the depths. Silas, his smile a thin, predatory line. Fletcher, his eyes wide with surprise as death took him. And Ilara, always Ilara. She was dancing in a dusty street, her laughter like wind chimes, and then the street was on fire, the laughter turning to a scream he could never unhear. He'd been paid to protect her father, a merchant with dangerous enemies. He'd failed. He'd been young, arrogant, and when the shooting started, he had saved himself. He'd run, and the memory of her small body in the ashes had chased him across a decade of violence and cheap whiskey. He woke with a start. It was night. The canyon was filled with a profound, chilling cold. A sliver of moon cast a pale, ghostly light into their hiding place. Una was huddled beside him, her small body curled against his for warmth. She was asleep, her breathing soft and even. In sleep, she looked like what she was, a child, not a symbol, not a ghost, just a little girl lost in a world of monsters. And he was the worst of them. He felt something in his hand. He looked down. She had placed a small, flat stone in his palm while he slept. It was smooth and cool, a worry stone, a silent offering. He closed his fingers around it, the solid weight a small comfort in the vast, cold dark. He was alive. He had survived the first night. But survival wasn't a victory. It was a postponement. Silas would come. The next days were a blur of pain and thirst. They moved at night, stumbling through a landscape of stone teeth and grasping shadows. Cassian leaned heavily on the canyon walls, using them to hold himself upright. The wound was a constant, throbbing agony, a fire that the fever fed. He was weak, his movements clumsy. Una was his eyes and ears. She would tug on his sleeve, pointing out a loose rock, a safer path. She found a seep of brackish water that was enough to keep them from dying of thirst. She found a handful of bitter berries that he choked down. She never spoke. Not a word. But they communicated in a language of gestures and shared glances. A touch on the arm meant stop. A pointed finger meant look. A shared look of exhaustion in the gray light of dawn was a conversation in itself. He learned the cadence of her silence. It wasn't empty. It was full of observation, of thought. During the day, they would hide, finding caves or overhangs where they could rest, invisible to anyone on the canyon rim. In these moments of forced stillness, the past would come for him. He saw the faces of all the men he'd killed, a gallery of ghosts. He saw the gold he'd earned, a pile of useless, glittering metal. He had traded his soul for it, coin by coin, until there was nothing left but the shell of a man named Cassian Bray. But that wasn't his name, not his real one. The one he was born with was softer, a name that belonged to a boy who believed in things. A boy who had a sister named Ilara. He had buried that name with her, had burned it in the fire of his own shame. One afternoon, while he was drifting in a feverish sleep, she took something from her pocket. It was a map, not of the canyons, but of something else. It was drawn on a piece of tanned hide, the lines faded and cracked. She unfolded it carefully. He watched her through slitted, heavy eyelids. She was tracing one of the lines with her finger. Then, she turned it over. On the back, written in a neat, elegant hand, was a single word. Caleb. His breath caught in his throat. It was a physical shock, more jarring than the bullet. Caleb. The name was a key, unlocking a door in his mind he had bricked over years ago. No one knew that name. No one was left alive who knew it. He pushed himself up, the movement sending a wave of nausea and pain through him. Where? He rasped. his voice a dry crackle. "Where did you get that?" Una looked up, her eyes wide. She quickly folded the map and tried to hide it, but he grabbed her wrist. His grip was weak, but his desperation was strong. "The name," he said, his voice raw. "Who wrote it?" She stared at him, her lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time, he saw fear in her eyes. Not of him, but for him. She shook her head, a small, frantic motion. She wouldn't tell him. He let her go, slumping back against the rock. The effort had cost him what little strength he had. Caleb. The name echoed in the silent, empty spaces of his soul. Who was this child? How was she connected to a past he had murdered and buried? The questions were a fresh torment, another layer of pain on top of the physical agony. Silas hadn't just wanted a stray removed, he wanted a history erased, and somehow Cassian was part of that history. The hunters found them 2 nights later. They were moving across an open patch of slick rock, the moonlight painting them as perfect silhouettes. There were 3 of them, spread out, moving with the confidence of men who knew their prey was wounded. Cassian saw them first. He shoved Una behind a cluster of boulders, his hand over her mouth. Though she made no sound, his heart was hammering against his ribs, each beat a fresh stab of pain in his side. He was in no shape to fight 3 men. A standing fight would be suicide. His pistol had 4 rounds left. His knife was a familiar weight in his hand. It wasn't enough. He needed an advantage. The terrain. It was always the terrain. He scanned the area, his mind racing, pushing past the fog of fever. A narrow wash to their left, its sides steep and shadowed. A gamble. He pulled Una close, his lips to her ear. "Run," he whispered, the first command he'd given her. "Down the wash. Don't stop." She looked at him, her eyes questioning. He gave her a small, desperate push. "Go!" She went. A flicker of motion, and she was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the wash. Cassian took a deep breath, the air searing his lungs. He checked his pistol. He drew his knife. He was a cornered wolf, too weak to run, too stubborn to die without a fight. He would buy her time. It was all he had left to give. He stepped out from behind the boulders. A shout went up from the hunters. A bullet whined past his ear, chipping stone from the rock beside him. He didn't fire back. He ran, a clumsy, lurching gait, not towards the wash, but in the opposite direction, drawing them away from her. It was a fool's gambit, a final useless act of penance. They took the bait. They saw a wounded man, an easy kill. Their shots were hurried, wild in their eagerness. He ducked behind another outcrop of rock, the impacts of their bullets sending shards of stone stinging against his cheek. He was buying seconds. Each second was a foot of distance for her. He risked a glance. They were closing in, fanning out to flank him. He was trapped. He leaned his head back against the cool stone, his breath coming in ragged sobs. This was it, the end of the line. He thought of the coin she had placed on his wound. He thought of the name on the map. Caleb, a boy's name, a dead name. Then he heard it, a small sound, a pebble skittering down the wall of the canyon high above the hunters. They heard it too. They looked up, momentarily distracted. In that instant, a large rock, the size of a man's chest, dislodged from the rim and came crashing down. It didn't fall. It was pushed. It struck one of the hunters with a sickening crunch of bone and flesh. He went down without a sound. The other 2 stared in shock, firing blindly up at the darkened canyon rim. Cassian didn't wait. He burst from behind his cover, firing twice. The first shot took one of the remaining men in the chest. The second caught the last man as he turned, the bullet striking him high in the shoulder, spinning him around. Cassian was on him before he could recover, the knife a silver arc in the moonlight. The fight was short, brutal, and silent. It ended with Cassian kneeling over the last man, his knife buried to the hilt. He pulled it free, the sound wet and final. He stood, swaying, covered in his own blood and the blood of others. He looked up at the canyon rim, a dark line against the star-dusted sky. He couldn't see her, but he knew she was there. The silent child had saved his life. She had become the hunter. He stumbled towards the wash, calling her name, his voice a shredded whisper. "Una!" She appeared at the mouth of the wash, a small, pale ghost in the moonlight. She ran to him, and for the first time, she reached out and clung to his leg, her small body trembling. He reached down and touched her head, his hand shaking uncontrollably. They stood there for a long moment, two survivors in a sea of death, the silence of the canyon, their only witness. The wound was torn open again. The fire was back, hotter than before. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that he didn't have much time left. He had to get her to safety, not just from Silas, but from this whole cursed land. He looked at the map he'd taken from her, the one with his name on the back. He knew the place it depicted, a hidden valley, a sanctuary his family had known about for generations, a place he hadn't thought of in 15 years. It was their only chance, a long shot, a journey he wasn't sure he could finish. He picked her up. She was light, a bundle of bones and fierce will. The effort sent a black wave of agony through him, but he locked his knees, refusing to fall. He started walking north, following a star he remembered from his childhood. Each step was a negotiation with death. He was no longer running from his past. He was running towards it, carrying the only future that mattered in his arms. The fever took him completely by the third day of their northward trek. The world dissolved into a nightmare landscape of shimmering heat and whispering ghosts. He walked without knowing he was walking, his body a machine running on the last dregs of will. Una was a warm, light weight in his arms, her presence the only real thing in a world of hallucination. He saw Ilara's face in the rocks, heard her laughter in the wind. He saw Silas, his face melting like wax, promising him gold and damnation. He collapsed in the shadow of a weathered butte, the world finally going black. This, he thought, with a strange sense of peace, was the end. He had tried. He had bought her a little more time. It was more than he had done for Ilara. He woke to a cool wetness on his lips. Water. He blinked, his eyes struggling to focus. Una was kneeling over him, a piece of cloth soaked in water held to his mouth. Her face was grim, her eyes dark with worry. He was lying in a shallow cave, shielded from the sun. His bandage was gone. The wound was raw and exposed, but it had been cleaned. Around the edges she had packed it with a poultice of chewed leaves, a desert remedy. Something she must have learned from whoever had raised her before Silas had torn her world apart. He tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness and pain pushed him back down. He was weaker than ever. The infection was deep, the fire in his blood burning low and steady. He looked at her, at this impossible child. She had kept him alive. She had dragged him, somehow, into this cave. She had found water. She had tended his wound. He saw the map lying on the cave floor beside him. She had been studying it. She looked from the map to his face, and then she did something that broke through his fevered haze. She reached out her small, dirt-smudged finger and gently, so gently, traced the angry red line of a scar on his forearm, a long-ago knife wound from a border town brawl. She followed its path from his wrist to his elbow, her touch as light as a moth's wing. Then, she moved her finger to his side and traced the swollen, inflamed edges of the bullet wound. She was reading him, reading his history in its violent script. She was tracing the path of his pain, acknowledging it, claiming it. A single tear, hot and sharp, escaped his eye and traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. It was the first tear he'd shed since he was a boy. He wasn't crying for the pain or for his own impending death. He was crying for this small, silent act of tenderness in a life that had been devoid of it for so long. He knew he was dying. The poultice might slow the poison, but it wouldn't stop it. He was too far gone. But looking at her fierce, desperate concentration, he knew he couldn't just give up. He couldn't leave her alone out here. He reached out and took the map. His hand trembled, but his resolve was iron. He had to tell her. He had to give her the last piece of himself. He pointed to a spot on the map, a cluster of symbols that marked the entrance to the hidden valley. Agua escondida, he whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. Water. Safe. He tapped the map, then pointed to her, then to the north. You. Go. She stared at him, her eyes filling with a terrible understanding. She shook her head violently, her dark hair flying. She would not leave him. He grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. Go, he insisted, his voice cracking with urgency. Silas will come. You must go. She pulled her hand away and stood up, her small body radiating a defiant fury. She pointed at him, then at herself, then jabbed a finger at the cave floor between them. Together. The message was unmistakable. He fell back, exhausted. He had no more strength to argue. He closed his eyes, the fever pulling him back under. Her stubbornness would kill them both. But as he drifted away, a strange thought surfaced. Maybe it was better this way. To die here, with her, than to die alone in some nameless gutter. To die as Caleb, the man who tried, rather than as Cassian, the man who ran. His dreams were of water, cool, clear water running over stones. He could hear it, smell it, taste it. He woke with a jolt. The sound was real. A faint, trickling sound from somewhere deep within the cave. Una was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the fever. He scrambled to sit up, crying out as the wound tore. He crawled to the mouth of the cave. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in hues of blood and gold. She was nowhere in sight. Una! He called, his voice a desperate croak. Then he saw her. She was coming back, her small dress dark with moisture. She was carrying her boot, filled to the brim with water. She had found the source, the Agua Escondida. It wasn't a valley. It was a spring, hidden deep inside this very cave system. The map hadn't been a destination. It had been a key to this specific place. She stumbled as she reached him, spilling some of the precious water. She fell to her knees and pushed the boot towards him. He drank, the water tasting of stone and life and hope. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. For a week, they stayed in the cave. The spring was a miracle. The water was clean and cold. Una found more edible plants in the shaded, damp corners of the cave system. She kept the poultice on his wound, fresh. Slowly, impossibly, the fever began to recede. The fire in his blood banked, the angry red of the wound fading to a dull, bruised purple. The pain was still there, a deep, abiding ache, but it was no longer a devouring monster. It was just pain. He could live with pain. He grew stronger. He could sit up without the world spinning. He could walk, leaning on the cave wall, to the spring and back. He watched her, this child who was more resourceful than any man he'd ever known. She moved with a quiet confidence, her silence a comfortable blanket, no longer a mystery to be solved. One day, as he was changing the dressing himself, she came and sat beside him. She watched his clumsy attempts to tie the knot. Then she reached out and took the ends of the cloth from him, tying it with her usual swift efficiency. He looked at the finished bandage, then at her. "Thank you," he said. The words felt inadequate, small and hollow. She looked at him, and for the first time, a small smile touched her lips. It was a fragile, fleeting thing, but it transformed her face, chasing away the old, haunted look. In that moment, he saw the child she was meant to be. He knew then that they couldn't stay. Silas was still out there. His pride would not let this go. He had paid for a death, and he would have one. Cassian's or Una's, it no longer mattered to him. They had to disappear. Not just hide, but vanish from the world. He was still weak, but he was alive. He had a debt to pay, not of gold, but of life itself. He had taken a bullet for her. Now he had to take a life for her. His old life. He had to kill Cassian Bray and let Caleb, the boy with the sister, live. They left the cave at dawn, 2 days later. He was gaunt and moved with a stiff, pained gait, but his eyes were clear. He carried his pistol, reloaded with ammunition he'd taken from Fletcher's belt. Una carried the map and a small bundle of dried plants. They moved north, but not towards civilization. They moved deeper into the wilderness, towards the blank spaces on the map, the places where a man and a child could be forgotten. The climax came a month later, in a place of wind-carved stone and ancient silence. They had made a small camp in a box canyon, a place with only one way in or out. It was a trap, but it was also a fortress. Cassian knew Silas would find them. He was counting on it. He came at dusk, just as Cassian knew he would, not with an army of men, but with 2. And himself. Silas wasn't a man to delegate his vengeance. He stood at the mouth of the canyon, his fine city clothes looking absurd in the rugged landscape. His face was no longer soft. It was a mask of cold reptilian fury. "Bray," he called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You have cost me a great deal of time and money, and you have something that belongs to me." Cassian stepped out from behind a rock, his pistol in his hand. Una was hidden, tucked away in a small crevice he'd found high up the canyon wall. "She belongs to no one," Cassian said, his voice steady. Silas laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "She is a title, a deed. Her grandfather was a sentimental fool who left his land to her line, a secret little addendum to his will. A secret I paid dearly to uncover. With her gone, the land reverts to the state, and my competing claim becomes primary. She is not a child. She is a complication. And you are a broken tool I should have discarded long ago." He gestured to Cassian's side. "I see my man left his mark, at least." He looked past Cassian, his eyes scanning the rocks. "Give her to me, and I'll let you crawl away and die in peace." "That offer has expired," Cassian said. He felt a strange calm settle over him. The pain in his side was a dull throb, a reminder of the choice he had made. He was no longer the man who had met Silas in a dusty office. That man was dead. "So be it," Silas said. He nodded to his men. They raised their rifles. The world exploded in gunfire, but Cassian was already moving, diving behind the rock as bullets splintered the stone where he had been standing. He didn't fire back. Not yet. He had a plan, a brutal, final plan. He had spent the day preparing. He had gathered dry brush and dead wood, piling it in the narrow entrance to the canyon. He had laid a trail of gunpowder from his hiding place to the pile. It was a desperate, scorched earth tactic. He peeked over the rock. Silas's men were advancing, moving from cover to cover. Silas stayed back, directing them, a general in a dirty war. Cassian fired once, a shot designed to miss, to draw their attention. As they ducked for cover, he lit the trail of gunpowder with a match. The fuse hissed, a fiery serpent racing across the canyon floor. It reached the pile of brush with a whoosh, and the entrance to the canyon erupted in a wall of flame. The fire roared, fed by the dry wood and the evening wind, sealing them in. Silas and his men were trapped. Their faces, illuminated by the fire, showed shock, then rage, then fear. They were the hunters, but now they were in the cage. "You're a fool, Bray!" Silas screamed over the roar of the flames. "You've trapped yourself with us." "I'm not trapped in here with you," Cassian called back, his voice cold and hard. "You're trapped in here with me." He came out from behind the rock, not as a man hiding, but as a judgment. He moved with a fluid grace he hadn't felt in years, the pain forgotten, his purpose absolute. He was not Cassian Bray, the mercenary fighting for gold. He was Caleb, the brother, fighting for the child in the rocks. The fight was not a duel. It was an extermination. He was relentless, a force of nature. He used the terrain, the shadows, the flickering, disorienting light from the fire. He was a ghost, a whisper of death. One man went down with a knife in his back. The other he dispatched in a flurry of desperate, close-quarters combat, ending it with a bullet. Now it was just Silas. The man stood alone, his fine suit smudged with dirt, his face pale in the firelight. He raised his pistol, his hand trembling. He was not a fighter. He was a man who paid others to fight for him. Cassian walked towards him, his own pistol hanging at his side. He didn't raise it. He stopped a few feet from Silas. "It's over," he said. Silas stared at him, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. "Who are you?" he whispered. "Why? For a stray? For a pittance of a contract?" "Her name is Una," Cassian said quietly. "And you're right. I was a broken tool, but even a broken thing can be put to a new purpose." He saw the decision in Silas's eyes a second before it happened. The man wasn't going to surrender. He was going to take Cassian with him. As Silas's gun came up, Cassian moved. He didn't draw his pistol. He closed the distance, his hand clamping down on Silas's wrist, forcing the gun up and away. The gun went off, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. Cassian drove his knife into Silas's side, the same place where he himself had been shot. A mirror of violence, a closing of a circle. Silas gasped, his eyes wide with the ultimate surprise. He sank to his knees, the fight draining out of him. Cassian stood over him, breathing heavily. He was not triumphant. He was just empty. He had killed the monster. He had burned the bridge to his old life. The fire at the canyon mouth was beginning to die down. Soon the way would be clear. He turned and looked up at the crevice where he had hidden Una. She was peering down, her small face a pale oval in the gloom. He raised a hand, a signal that it was safe. He collapsed then, the last of his strength leaving him. The wound in his side, strained by the fight, had reopened. Blood was soaking his bandage, hot and sticky. He had won, but the cost was too high. He lay on the ground, the smell of smoke and blood in his nostrils, and felt the darkness closing in again. He had crawled from the brink of death once. He didn't have the strength to do it again. His last thought was of the girl. He had saved her. That was enough. He didn't know how long he was out. It could have been minutes or hours. He woke to a familiar touch, a small hand on his forehead. Una was beside him, her face streaked with tears, the first he had ever seen her shed. She had climbed down from her hiding place. She was pressing a fresh, clean piece of cloth, torn from Silas's own pristine shirt, against his wound. He looked at her, at this child who refused to let him die. He had chosen to take a bullet for her. He had chosen to fight for her. Now, lying on the edge of oblivion, he made the final choice. He chose to live for her. He would not leave her. He would crawl back from the brink, inch by bloody inch, if that's what it took. He would raise this child who was meant to die in his place. He reached out, his hand finding hers. He squeezed it, a faint pressure, a promise. The months that followed were quiet. They found the hidden valley from the map, a small patch of impossible green hidden in the heart of the red desert. They built a life there, a small, fragile thing made of silence and shared tasks. He healed. The wound in his side became a puckered, ugly scar, a permanent reminder of the day his life had broken in two. She never spoke, but her silence was a language he now understood perfectly. She was his shadow, his companion, his reason. He watched her grow. He saw the fear fade from her eyes, replaced by a quiet curiosity. He taught her how to track, how to read the sky. She taught him how to find the quiet places in himself he thought had long been burned to ash. He never knew her real name or who her people were. The map was her only history, and it had led her to him. He tried out names for her sometimes, whispering them in the quiet of the evening. Sarah, Maria, Ilara. But none of them fit. They were ghosts from another life. She was something new. One evening, as they sat by their small fire, watching the stars appear in the vast, dark sky, he looked at her and felt a familiar sense of being lost. He was her guardian, her protector, but he didn't even know what to call her. She must have sensed his thoughts. She looked up from the fire, her dark eyes meeting his. She pointed a small finger at her own chest. "Una," she said, her voice soft, unused. It was the first word he had ever heard her speak. Then she pointed her finger at him. He waited, his breath held. He expected her to say Cassian, or maybe even Caleb. She looked at him, a long, steady gaze, as if she were seeing him for the very first time, not as the man he was, or the man he had been, but as the man she had made him. "Father," she said. He didn't know what to name her, so she named him.